Good evening, everybody. This is Noir, and welcome back to Let's Play Aria of Sorrow. So, when we last left off, we were just finishing up the dance hall. Just a few things in our way, and of course, a little sliding puzzle. Why did I say puzzle? A little sliding obstacle. Which basically just guarantees that we've beaten the big golem before we head out of here to the next place. Which is the inner quarters. This is one of my favorite locations in this game. Some very nice backgrounds and great enemies too. I'm particularly fond of Persephone, who's in a lot of Castlevania games. She's basically Dracula's maid, and she's very polite, but she still tries to kick your ass as soon as she bows and starts things up. You may have noticed when we walked in she said Yokoso, which is Japanese for welcome. So again, just impeccable manners even as she's kicking your ass. Another enemy I really like here is Nemesis, who's one of many different kinds of enemies in the Castlevania games, who's basically a ghostly presence that only has a single object that you can hit, in this case a sword. In later games, there's a male version of this character called Alistair, which is basically the male version of Nemesis in Greek mythology as well, which is kind of cool. Well, that was a bit unusual. Clearly we can't deal with that enemy yet. But it was very silly looking, if I remember correctly. Didn't get a very good look at it, but I'm sure we'll see it later. So actually, the next boss here is coming up very quickly. Almost as soon as we enter the living quarters, we're going to get to it. I don't know what is up with this room. It's very cool looking. It has that thunderstorm in the background, and then there's this one Persephone in there, who is really beating me up. You can get to see her attacks pretty well here. But I have forgotten what, if anything, there is about this room that's special. If there's anything, I can't really tell what it is. Let's just heal up and move on. So this, I would say, is the first boss in the game who really gets difficult. This isn't quite the wake-up call I was talking about earlier, but it can be challenging. This is the Headhunter. You'll notice lots of heads on the back wall, which is kind of a spooky image. But there are only 3 that you actually fight against. The Headhunter has the ability to change form depending on which head it's using. You may have noticed this one is a beautiful woman, like a countess or something like that. She just attacks you with a knife. She's the easiest of the 3. This next head is that of a wizard or sorcerer of some kind, an old man. And when Headhunter has it on, he flies around the room casting spells of various kinds. There's actually a pretty serious boss near the end of Order of Ecclesia who's a little like this guy. But yeah, he basically has a flame spell, which summons those 2 little fiery heads that go back and forth, and then an electric spell that is probably the easiest to dodge of them. It's just 3 little thunderbolts that move vertically. The hardest thing I would say actually about this guy is not dodging his attacks, but rather just hitting him. He's a little quicker than he looks, deceptively quick. And of course he's always in the air, so a little difficult to get him in range for a decent attack. The tiny devil soul is helping me out a great deal here. But actually, this is not the hardest phase of the boss. The hardest phase is the final one, where he has a lizard head that turns him into this strange lizard-human hybrid, who crawls around on the wall, on the ceiling like Grant Nasty from Castlevania 3. We get poisoned here, so I put on the anti-venom. Poison doesn't work in this game quite like it normally does in other games. In this game, it doesn't cause you to gradually lose health, but instead causes all of your stats to go down, so you do less damage and take more damage. Pretty nasty status effect, actually, worse than a typical poison. And like I said earlier, there's not a lot of anti-venoms in this game. So this boss can be a bit of a pain. He's never in position when he's on the ceiling for any kind of reasonable attack. You basically always have to put yourself out there in order to get him in range of an attack while he's on the ceiling. Meanwhile, while he's on the floor, he will lick you a great deal. And his attacks are surprisingly robust for a guy who's also this quick and hard to fight. The interesting thing about the Headhunter, of course, is that he's a 3-phase fight at all, which you haven't had up to this point. In fact, I would say a single one of his phases is about as challenging as any of the fights have been up to this point. So he really does seem to come out of nowhere in terms of the level of challenge here. And when you kill him, all of the heads in the wall disappear. Not entirely sure why that happens, but I suppose he was a load-bearing boss. And you get the Headhunter Soul, which actually increases your stats depending on how many souls you've obtained, which near the end of the game can be one of the better, stat-boosting souls. Kind of similar to the map exploration bonus you get from certain armor pieces in other Castlevania games. But yeah, having gotten through that, kind of by the skin of my teeth, I decided I needed to save, just in case. When you go back in the room, however, you'll notice it's not empty anymore. This happens with a couple of boss rooms. Instead, there's a witch here. I like the fact that witches, kind of like student witches, turn into a cat when they die, so to speak. But this cat actually has a hat on. It's still wearing the hat from when it was a witch. And it can hurt you, unlike the cat that the student witch turns into. Then we have some Valkyries here, an enemy that can be surprisingly difficult to take care of, not because they have a lot of health or have strong attacks, but because of the way they move, which is very confusing. We also have the Disc Armors here, who are some of my favorite enemies in any Castlevania game. They're just so wacky. They throw their disc around like a yo-yo. But it does do a lot of damage, so be careful with them. This whole area, actually, on the top of the inner quarters, is really interesting to me. It's one of the more evocative set pieces in the entire game of Aria of Sorrow. And it's funny that this area is totally optional, and it only really gives you one important weapon. Oh, sorry, plus the Undine Soul. So forget what I said about this being optional. It actually is necessary. But it is certainly out of the way. This weapon is certainly optional, but I would definitely get it if I were you. It's right here, and it's the Fronting, which has got to be some kind of Germanic name. I'm not sure where that sword comes from. But it has a poison element to it, which is interesting. Not a lot of weapons in the game have that, but a surprising number of enemies in this game are weak to it, so it's definitely a useful sword to pick up. Heading back here is always a little bit tedious. To be honest, I wish there was a way to just drop from the top of the room to the bottom. That would have made things a little more streamlined. Oh, and I get a very useful soul here from Curly, which is one example of the admittedly pretty silly translation errors that crop up every now and then in this game. The character should actually be called Kali, but it's pretty obvious that in Japanese, Kali and Curly would be the same thing. They'd both be pronounced Kadi. So some translator clearly has never watched Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but oh well, that's the way it goes. Curly is actually a very useful soul, as we'll see later on, because it's a rush-type soul, where you turn into a giant monster and sweep forward across the screen. There's a place in the game where having a soul like that is very useful. Anyway, we're about to use our new soul, Undine, or Undini, depending on how you care to pronounce it, which lets us walk on water. Rather curious thing, but it is necessary to get through this part of the inner quarters. And a few other areas. The soul is actually a little more useful than it might seem at first. You'd think you only get a little bit of a height benefit from standing on top of water, but actually it's the barrier to quite a few places in the mid-game. The music in this area is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, with the music being good, but really not that exciting or catchy. I would actually say a lot of the music in this game is pretty simple, which is one of the best things about it, actually. Something that a lot of people dislike about the music in Harmony of Dissonance, I think, is that it's unnecessarily complicated, and so it sounds very, well, dissonant. Whereas the music in this game is at least tuneful, even if it's not particularly interesting. We fight a few Persephones. Thanks to our new sword, they go down in 2 hits. And the Valkyries go down in 1 hit, which is very helpful. I never like having to let the Valkyries make a pass, because if they go around you, it's always really hard to find them again in order to take care of them. They can cause you a lot of annoyance. We also have a very strange enemy in here, the Kyoma Demon, who's basically imitating your movements in the mirror and can only be attacked when he jumps out of the mirror in order to attack you. And we find another warp point. It's pretty useful. We're going to head back and talk to Mina. I'm not a particular fan of the warp room design in this game. It's certainly very striking and creepy, but I like the prettier approach that's taken in Symphony of the Night, and of course Harmony of Dissonance, which rips off Symphony of the Night extremely. That's very vague advice, Mina. Also, not very helpful advice. We already know exactly what it means to stand on top of the water, because it's a soul we just got. But oh well. So Hammer's got some new stuff in the shop, including selling the sword that we... Oh, sorry, I'm being stupid. I'm selling, not buying. Okay, so we're going to sell some of our stuff in order to get some more gold. I decided to get rid of the combat knives. They're cool weapons, but we really don't need them anymore. We're going to find some better knife or fist-type weapons later on. I also get rid of the katana, because I really don't use swords like that. We're mostly just going to keep the ones that are at the same rough level as our current weapons, and that are the type of weapon we're likely to use. I mostly stick to spears, the slashing type, or sorry, I should say thrusting type swords, and a couple of like fist or knife type weapons in this game. Other than that, I'm willing to sell almost anything. So now that we have plenty of gold, I'm going to go ahead and buy Graham, which is a pretty decent non-elemental thrust type sword. And the steel plate would be a very high defense boost, but on the other hand, it would mean getting rid of the samurai armor bonuses. However, I'm going to do it anyway because I am a chicken. And as we'll see soon, there are very good reasons for me to be one. So, back we head to the inner quarters. The inner quarters is interesting because unlike a lot of the areas in the game where you tend to fight the boss at the end of exploring most of the area, in the living quarter, or sorry, the inner quarters, you fight the boss very early on, and then there is a lot of this area to explore after you fight the boss. One thing that can make the Kyoma demon kind of tricky is he generally will not come out of the mirror to attack you until you're facing away from him. But of course that also means that you're not in the right position to attack him back until you turn around. So you might notice that the Graham weapon here does pretty good damage, but actually, because we're not getting that benefit from having the poison element, we're taking more hits to get rid of regular enemies. So honestly, not the best purchase. I should have just stuck with fronting. Oh well. One nice thing about this game is even when your loadout is suboptimal, you can still do pretty well. So Lilith here is a pretty good stat-raising soul. Raises your intelligence by 8. Intelligence, like in most, RPG-type games, basically means you do more damage when you cast spells. In this game, using the bullet-type souls. One thing that's kind of interesting about this game, that I just thought of because of Lilith, later on there is a powered-up version of Lilith called a succubus, appropriately enough. And you would think that the souls of enemies that are recolors of each other in this game would do similar things, but they actually don't. In a lot of cases, recolored enemies will have souls that do totally different things, and the succubus-type enemies are definitely one of those. The witch is another example. The witch soul will let you cast, magical spells that do a lot of damage, but the student witch soul will let you turn into a cat, which is a very different type of witchly spell. And here we are on the top floor. This is where Arikado told us to go, and where the end of the game happens. However, we're not actually able to get up to any other part of the top floor at this point. This is just a tease. So for now, we're heading straight through. Back to the main hallway. So at this point, you're expected to fall back down, and then, having the Undine soul, this is the time when you go down to the lower part of the main area, and get on top of the water in order to go to the labyrinth. But we're going to take a little detour on the way there because we're exploring. And get beaten up by some witches because we are not very good at this game. Finally, I get the picture that really we should be using grunting. It's really good against most humanoid enemies, or enemies that sort of have like a flesh attribute to them, where they're not made of rocks or sticks or things like that. So any humanoid, generally speaking, it's pretty good to use poison against. Oof. One very annoying thing about Lilith and the succubus later is that they can sweep right past you, meaning that they're close to you so they can do a lot of damage, but you're facing the wrong direction to hit them. So they're sort of a bit more maneuverable than your typical enemy, and that can make them tricky to deal with. Now, I thought that there was a secret room around here, and there probably is, but I have completely forgotten how to get to it, so we won't be getting to it in this playthrough, unfortunately. It's good not to reveal all the secrets in this game, and after all, there is a lot to discover in this game, so if you're intrigued, I definitely think you should play the game and find those secrets on your own. I know, that's a ridiculous excuse, but I'm going with it anyway. So there's two places here where you can drop down into the main part of the castle, and I'm taking the second one. It really doesn't make much of a difference. If you want to complete the whole map, obviously, you're going to have to do both. But one thing about both of these things is that when you drop down from this area, you will not be able to get back up. In order to do that, you have to have the ability to fly, which comes much later on in the game. So it's a good thing there are warp rooms. So here we are back near the beginning. And I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to go to some rooms that we couldn't get to with our original set of skills. For one thing, we have a double jump now, which opens up a lot. So now we've picked up the Ancient Book 1. One of the stranger items in this game. It's just something you can read, and it says, "The first spirit's a demon from hell fires." A little difficult to tell what that means, but since spirit does mean soul, you can assume that might have something to do with equipping a certain type of soul, in perhaps a certain circumstance. That's a rather curious part of the game. We'll be going there later, but for now it's just a tease. So skipping past a little more fooling around here, and getting lost. Here we are, very close to the beginning of the game, actually. This is where we got the Flying Armor Soul, right after the first boss. And you may have noticed a big platform here that now, thanks to the Undine Soul, we can reach. And this will lead us to the next area. There's also a part even earlier than this where you can walk on top of the water and get an elfin robe, which is a pretty useful piece of armor. Here we are in the Floating Garden, one of the stranger and more mysterious areas in Aria of Sorrow. There's some cockatrices here, which can turn you to stone, just like the Catoblepus in the study. And a bunch of floating platforms. Also, these guys, I've always really liked these enemies, the Dead Warriors. They appear in this game, as well as Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin. I don't recall if they appear in Order of Ecclesia. But they are kind of more goofy enemies, so I could see why they might not appear in that game. But we will be tackling most of the garden in the next episode, so for now, good night everybody, and I'll see you next time.